to sue when it isn't. And this is the real Facebook Oversight Board. I'll be moderating today's event about a workforce that is the bedrock Facebook is built on, but which few people have heard of: content moderators. These are tens of thousands of workers around the world who check Facebook posts against Facebook's rules and who take content down that breaks those rules. Now, it's 8 days before the US election, and there is deep anxiety about how disinformation and hate on Facebook are tearing at the fabric of our democracy. So why does this problem seem to get worse and worse? One reason is that in 2020, on the world's largest social network, clickbait still rules. Lies and hate still travel on Facebook like a California wildfire. Things are still so bad that in 2 days, Mark Zuckerberg will testify once again to the Senate about what Facebook is doing to address this problem and protect American democracy. One of the things he'll probably point to try to show Facebook is serious about the issue is his massive workforce of content moderators. So, content moderators are the firefighters on the front lines guarding our elections. They're so critical to Facebook's work that Facebook has hauled them back into their offices during the pandemic and kept them in the offices even with active COVID cases. So who are these workers? What do they say about their jobs? If their work is set up as it should be, why is Facebook still such a mess? Here to discuss this with us today is an amazing lineup. Foxglove has been working for over a year with dozens of content moderators in the US and Europe and are delighted to have two of them with us today. Viana Ferguson and Allison Trebaz worked in content moderation at Facebook and are speaking live about their experiences for the first time. Earlier today, we also recorded an anonymous interview with a current content moderator for Facebook. Joining these workers are Professor Sarah Roberts of UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, who literally wrote the book on content moderation called Behind the Screen, and Jade Magnus Ogunaki of Color of Change, the US's largest online racial justice group. Sarah, if I may, I'd like to start with you, and you could set the scene for us here. How does Facebook do content moderation, and why do we hear about moderators' work so rarely?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the first thing to articulate is that for the general public, if they think of content moderation at all, which I would say they probably don't, although more so now than in the past, they tend to imagine an ecosystem where computers are doing the decision making. That is not their fault. I think for a long time, the big platforms, Facebook among them, have promulgated a myth that if any adjudication of content occurs, it's by computers, it's by algorithm, something magical is happening behind the scenes, and the public doesn't really need to think too much about it. The fact is that while there is computation and there are automated systems certainly at play at Facebook and elsewhere, there is also a fundamental, important, mission critical legion of workers who are human beings who are dispersed around the globe, who do this work day in and day out. And what they do, those folks who are on the production floor from whom you'll hear, receive content that's either culled by automated means or reported by users like us. And they review that content and decide whether or not it's breaking Facebook's rules, essentially. And that is the guideline to which they are adjudicating. As you can imagine, if someone has gone to the trouble to report a piece of content, the potential is great that it is actually in contravention of the rules. And those rules are things like disallowing gratuitous violent content, disallowing hate speech, disallowing abuse to persons and animals. It can also be as innocuous sometimes as something that's completely allowed, like a cat picture. So in a person's day-to-day, they vacillate between these poles of the banal and the horrifying. And this is the work they do, and they do it rapidly. They do it with a great deal of expertise, and they do it really under non-disclosure agreements that disallow and preclude them from talking about the kind of work they do on all of our behalf.
Right. And And of course, in the run up to the election, with the election in just 8 days' time, all eyes are really on the information traveling on Facebook and what they're going to do about things like white supremacist groups and fake news and election disinformation. And these are really the people on the front lines. Now, you've written about the problems that this workforce faces and how crucial content moderation is. You did a whole book about it. If it's so crucial, why do you think that Facebook has it done almost entirely by outsourced contractor staff and not by employees?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the $64,000 question. The reason I think is complex, but we can certainly pull out a few important threads. This, frankly, is work that for a long time was not considered as mission critical as it has turned out to be at Facebook. The efforts at social media companies went to the development of products, the creation of new functionality, the improvement of technology, almost a technological arms race against other platforms to introduce new functionality. And frankly, the need for content moderation work at Facebook and other places, and the fact that it's done by human beings at a company that really has built its reputation on its technological prowess, means that they want to downplay that need. I mean, the need for people to constantly monitor and watch people's behavior, because people can't behave themselves on platforms, to say the least, means that that really flies in the face of rhetoric that suggests that Facebook and other platforms are really happy places to be, that we ought to want to spend all of our, not only our leisure time, but our civic engagement, our interpersonal relationships. So it's not something they're likely to tout. I think the second thing is that, you'll hear from the CEO himself that Facebook does not want to be in a position to be an arbiter of truth. Well, that may be, but since we know that content moderators exist at Facebook and the numbers are tens of thousands around the world, they're arbiters of something. So to me, that forces the issue of then what are they arbiters of? And I would argue, and I do argue in my work, in my book, that what the content moderators are primarily tasked with doing is doing brand protection and brand management for Facebook. Sometimes that protects the rest of us, sometimes it doesn't. And then finally, to your point about why is it outsourced, there are different answers that you would get. One thing is that we need a global workforce to respond to these issues for the different cultural, linguistic, regional kinds of information that people need to adjudicate for. That's kind of the party line, right? But the other reason is that to outsource, it gives a certain operational and in many cases geographic distance for these workers who are doing work from Facebook. So
That's
we know
right.
that
Yeah,
we know that
other, to hold people at arm's length. I think
that's
right.
right. It creates an opportunity for plausible deniability, right? So we know that in other industries like textiles, when a factory goes down in Bangladesh and garments are pulled from the rubble, apparently Walmart, H&M, and others can reasonably say, "Gosh, we didn't know our work was outsourced there." And I think that's kind of a distancing attempt that Facebook and other social medias undertake, because they know that there's harm that come to workers through the process of doing this work.
Well, I'm glad we have the opportunity to redress that problem today by actually hearing from the workers themselves. And I'd actually like to go to you, Viana, now, if that's okay. We're really excited to have you. Viana is a former Facebook content moderator who worked in Arizona. Viana is speaking with us all today for the first time in public, I think, and we are absolutely delighted to have her here with us. Viana, you worked at Facebook, I think, for nearly 2 years, if that's right. Could you tell us what you did there and what you hope to achieve by joining, and I guess whether those hopes were realized?
So ultimately, when I was hired in 2016, I came on not really sure what content moderation I would be working for, but at the interview, they did reveal that it was Facebook. And so it ended up being this responsibility of a place that I'm on pretty frequently to kind of just help, again, content moderate. But as they said, it was about preventing harm in the world in a community that is kind of expanded beyond like physical spaces, but it's still this like really, really tangible community. I'm on it. I'm there. So it was about preventing harm and stuff like that. I ended up being the subject matter expert, which means I was very, very focused on policy and how content came against that policy and how I was able to action based on that policy. And so it was really, really important to me to be about the policy and leave my personal feelings out of it and things like that. And so it was really, really important to make sure that the community by and large was a welcoming place. And that was the goal of it, I would say. But no, I did not achieve that overall, definitely not. I would say that Sarah's notes on it were definitely that. I definitely felt like it ended up being a product for Facebook, and that's what I was protecting more than anything.
More than community, what mattered was the product.
More than anything. Like it was about protecting the Facebook product.
Gosh, that's pretty damning. A lot of people want, especially now with the election in 8 days, to know what kinds of things Facebook does behind the scenes to deal with disinformation, to deal with racism, to deal with hate. Did you experience debates inside when you were working about how to grapple with hateful or racist content? And what happened if you would say, kind of up the chain, hey, this is, I see a problem here. Did you feel like people were listening?
Certainly not. I definitely felt like it was a situation where if you had a problem with a specific piece of content, or you found really what we call gaps in the policy, where it was like, okay, maybe there's this hole that is allowing a lot of hate to kind of come through. I, as the policy and as we've been told, that is not the intention. So let me just show you guys what the problem is. And it really just became like a battle for whether or not you were going to be assertive about trying to make change or about pushing your career forward. And it was really became a conflict between whether or not you were going to push an agenda of moving the policy forward into something that was helpful, or if you were going to get in line and assimilate.
What do you mean by getting in line and assimilating? Can you say more? I mean, what can you think of a particular example where, you saw something that was obviously problematic and you just didn't get heard?
Yeah, I mean, and this is really on like a simple small thing, but a great example is just a piece of content that I had gotten where it was a photo of a family, a white family, and it looked like they had adopted a young Black girl. So there was just one Black girl and then 2 adults and probably 2 other children. So the picture itself is very, very innocent, but the caption on it said, "A house is not a home without a pet." And so when you put those 2 things together, it really makes it very, very conflicting. And so it was very, very blaring to me. But in speaking with one of my managers, she didn't have the same perspective. And because of that, I really wasn't able to confidently make the decision because there was no way for me to support that without any other evidence than my perspective of knowing that was racist.
Well, saying that it's obvious racism.
Yeah, there was no reference I could use. There was no other meme. There was no Urban Dictionary. There was no other references to say that, hey, this is why this is racist. And so without that type of evidence, so to speak, you're not able to make a decision on what you see in front of you. You're not able to make a decision on something that you think is causing harm. And it's your job to prevent harm, but you're not really allowed to do that because of situations like that.
And I think the thing that's so baffling to me about that is you've got a caption there that basically is saying that a Black child is non-human, right? That it is somehow subhuman, less than a human, is basically a cute little pet for a family. What happened? Like, did you try and explain that to the manager? Tell me more about what that conversation looked like.
Ultimately, it was just like, well, no, a house, it's a true statement. A house isn't a home without a pet. And it's like, there's no pet in the picture. And she's like, well, I'm like, and there's also no home in the picture. Do you see how none of these things are equating? And it was just like, it's a true statement. A house is not a home without a pet. I agree with that. And that picture is innocent. There's nothing wrong with that picture. And so it was like, I don't know how else to explain to you that none of these things one of these things is not like the other. And it really just became like a full stop. And it really became a point where you just had to decide, like, is this the thing that I'm going to battle for? Am I just going to let this one go and try something else next time? You really just have to decide if this is what you're going to.
Did that disturb you? You must have found that profoundly offensive, no?
I mean, 2 years later, it's still like front of mind. So.
And the other thing is, your ability to hold on to your job. What could you push back very often, and insist on things like the inherent humanity of Black people and still keep your job? Could you do that?
I would say not inherently. Certainly wasn't necessarily encouraged. If I wanted to move up in the company, I definitely found, like I said, a conflict in whether or not I was going to be vocal about the decision-making process. Because again, in my position, it was really, really like, I was like a middleman in terms of, I really supported my team in making their decisions. So if they were stumped on something and we needed some more like help and guidance, they would call me. So it was really important to me to know my policy, to be able to really, really help them make their decision, because it was still their decision. Even if I had all my expertise, I had to let them know, like, look, it doesn't matter if you get this wrong, it's still you getting this wrong. So everything I said doesn't actually matter if you don't agree with me, because if you get it wrong, it's still on you, it's still your job, it's still you who's on the line. So it creates a lot of conflict between people when you have a disagreement. It creates a lot of conflict when there's a different disparity on the perspective. And again, when you get the pushback from management that you're really not really supposed to speak on it. And if you don't have the support, you can't do it. And if you do not have evidence, so to speak, I felt like a lawyer at times, because I needed to just have so many things to back up what I said. But it would be like, I know this, because this is the life I live. I'm on Facebook. So it just became a conflict. And the other thing about it is that if you're not in content, if you're not doing content, you don't know how the internet has changed. You don't know what's changed since yesterday. It changes so fast. Like even right now, I don't know how they're actioning. I don't know what the content is, but I know right now that little girl who, those two little girls who got in a fight at that party, there's content going on about it. If they're arguing about what to do to that little girl, it could be violating content. If they're bullying either one of those little girls, it could be violating content. But there's two bullies, and we don't know. There's two perspectives on which one is the bully, and so there's a lot of pull. There's a lot of you have to pay very, very close attention to try to make the right decision to protect people, and they don't make it easy.
And I've got another question about diversity at Facebook. Were the managers white, or were they also Black and Latinx? Like, was there a racial element in the company structure at all?
So I would say there were definitely a few people in management that were white and things like that, but it definitely seemed like it came at a cost. Like, I don't know, I guess we call it drinking the Kool-Aid in essence or whatever, but it seemed like you had to assimilate to get to those positions. You had to swallow a lot to get to those positions, and you had to choose your battles. You just had to choose your battles. There were things you weren't going to win, even if you were right, even if you were, and when I say right, not just about being right, but even if this is the right thing to do, if this is the right decision to make, you don't get to make that decision because you don't have the policy to back it up. And if you don't have the policy to back it up, you got to go find somebody up there who will. And so you go up the ladder and you try to get somebody who will say, yeah, I see what you mean. This is a hole in the policy. And then you wait months and months and months, and every 2 weeks you hope it's the thing that you've been battling for, and it's just never is. And so it's just a lot. It takes a lot. And again, you're rallying against the machine, and you're like, but I am the machine.
And do you think that those policies that you tried to struggle over and that you had to enforce, do you think that they disproportionately affect Black and minority Facebook users?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's definitely seemed to be like a focus on one way or the other. I mean, racism and hate speech is very, very heavy, so that makes sense or whatever. But because of, again, the lack of perspective, I think, of at least the original policy creators, there's just hate racism they can't see. When racist things happen to me, I have to put it through this filter of, maybe they didn't mean that. Maybe that's not what they said. But that's how I live my life. I don't just do that at Facebook as a content moderator. I live my life every single time something bad happens to me. I think maybe it's just because they were having a bad day. I'm like, well, no, they couldn't have been having that bad day. They just said they were having a good day. And so you just go through all of these things of why this is, nope, I can't ignore it. It is racist. And that's not what happens in policy. You have to find ways to prove your point, and it's to people that don't know what you mean.
You have said that you think that this is, in principle, an amazing job, that it could be a really great, really important job. What would that look like?
I honestly, I think that looks like Facebook really hiring content moderators. You can't have a scapegoat when something goes wrong. You need to bring it in-house. I don't think content moderators, especially the ones that are outsourced specifically, feel embraced by Facebook. It definitely was adversarial. It definitely was us and them situation. It definitely was like a dangling of the bait. Like, if you don't act right, you're not going to get to Facebook. You don't have, even when they visited, if I didn't act right, they wouldn't let me talk to the Facebook people when they visited the site. And so it's things like that they have to bring it in-house. Another thing, I guess I would say, in terms of just demands and everything, I think they really have to release the policy and tell us really how they're doing it, because I think that will reveal how the policy has the holes in the policy. We'll be able to see them maybe more clearly than they will. I don't know if it's necessarily to the entire public, but I think a real Facebook oversight board would help with something like that, just because of a lack of perspective. Certainly hiring people of color, but it's more than just putting them in a position to be a token. Like, I token all day long. I don't want to be a token. It's about listening and really just knowing that, again, content moderators who are in it know most. Even a manager who doesn't do content every day knows less about content moderation than a content moderator who does it every single day for hours, because they know how the internet changed yesterday. They know what's different. They know that now drug dealers are doing this to tell people I sell drugs. You know, there's a difference, and they can tell. And it takes too long to make the change.
So listen, can I ask a question about the election? So you were there for a couple of elections and for some midterms. How do you feel about the election coming up? Are you worried about what's going to happen on Facebook in the next few weeks?
Basically, there's going to be a wave of hate speech. There's going to be a certain amount of, depending on which way it goes, it's definitely just going to be more violent. It definitely seems to have gotten more violent. People seem to have gotten more vocal about the violence they're willing to execute towards people. And so I'm just worried about that crowd sense, that encouragement, because it does feel like they feel supported. It's like they're waving this flag, and it's like, I see you too. And I'm feeling that on my side because, you know, Black Lives Matter and the whole thing or whatever, but it's definitely, I'm definitely feeling like I'm losing friends because they're more vocal about how they don't care or really do care, you know? So it's gonna happen. It doesn't matter who wins, it's gonna happen. And so Facebook has to be prepared for that. They have to be ready. We did things like tried to put together decks to try to remind us of where the hate speech is and stuff like that or whatever. But again, it comes down to content moderators being able to see and notice the changes. And then when those changes happen, being able to make the right decision based on what they see is changing, not based on the policy that was good 2 weeks ago, but we know it changes. So let's change it with it, you know? So it'd be helpful to make faster changes listening to content moderators.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And I know it really is really important and risky and not easy for you to speak. So thank you for making the time. Now, the rampant spread of racism and hate on Facebook has drawn criticism from some of the biggest racial justice groups in the United States, many of whom sit on the real Facebook Oversight Board. One of the very largest is, of course, Color of Change. I think the US's biggest online racial justice group. I'd like to go now to Jade Magnus Oganaki, Color of Change's Senior Campaign Director for Media, Culture, and Economic Justice. First of all, Jade, could you just tell us in general what's Color of Change's interest in this area and in what's going on Facebook?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Fiona, for sharing your story. It was incredibly powerful. For years, Color of Change has been demanding that Facebook take aggressive action. You know, I think at this point, we've been working to push policies to reform Facebook for the past, I think, 6 years. It initially got kicked off when we found out after a couple campaigns that Facebook had hired a firm to smear color of change with anti-Black and anti-Semitic tropes. And, we've been demanding that Facebook take aggressive action to tackle these threats to our democracy that continue to fester on the platform. From the groups feature, we know that a murderer found out about a protest and organized on it in a Facebook group on the Facebook platform. And a really, really big piece of this is the way that Facebook has refused to listen to their employees and also, refused to moderate the hateful, racist, violent content that their employees flag. I think additionally, this is a big tech issue. It's also a worker issue, though. Tech companies like Facebook are just praised for their benefits and the parental leave and the pay and the flexible working. And they're really looked at in many ways. They're given this progressive veneer because they're looked at as the future of work. But there's a second group of employees, which is disproportionately filled with people from Black communities, people from low income communities who actually fuel these companies, and they're consistently treated as second class. They're the security guards who keep them safe, the food service workers who, ladle up those gourmet meals, and they're the content moderators who are excluded by Facebook from these, progressive work environments. What we know is that content moderators have minimal access to healthcare, to mental health support. They lack the support and the resources needed to do their jobs. And they're on the front lines to support democracy, to protect democracy in the United States, but they're not given any of the benefits of, full-time employees. So it's definitely a big tech issue. Facebook has continuously been an arbiter of hate groups, propagating hate all across the platform. And they've had plenty of opportunities to sort of rectify the issues that they have. And, especially hearing Viana's story, we just know that it's something they're not interested in. It's a shame that content moderators like Viana, they use their voices, their bravery to push for change at the company. How many of us feel comfortable pushing back to our bosses about anything, much less, moderating racist content. And she's brave enough to do that. And instead of taking action, Facebook just ignores the warnings, and they continue this voter suppression, this racism, this election disinformation.
I think the core question that arises from what you've said is basically, and I think you've launched a campaign today, you and a bunch of other groups, basically saying, do your job, directed at Mark Zuckerberg. Given what we've heard from Viana, can he do his job without empowering moderators to do theirs?
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg has not only a disregard for our democracy, he has a disregard for the political climate and the polarization of the United States, but he also has a huge disregard for the employees that keep Facebook running. Instead of taking accountability for the ways that disinformation and racist and hateful content has spread across Facebook, every time there's a PR crisis, he passes the buck to, the quote unquote hundreds of new content moderators who aren't even given the support that they need to do their job. Instead of listening to the moderators and their expertise about the way that hate groups are evolving on the platform and proliferating on the platform, Facebook makes a decision every single day to ignore their warnings. And this hateful content has real world consequences for Black people. Look at what happened, in Kenosha. That was a Black Lives Matter protest that turned into a site of violence with 3 people killed due to the ways that Facebook had refused to take action. The event that the murderer had gone to was flagged. It was flagged, and Facebook decided to keep it up. So it's an incredibly deliberate choice.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to go to the other content moderator who has agreed to speak with us today, who is Allison Trebaz, who was Viana's colleague working in content moderation in Arizona. Allison, you've spoken to me before of a culture of fear that stops workers being heard on these issues. What was that like?
Absolutely. So there's a couple layers that contribute to the fear that moderators feel. First of all, they're kind of disempowered at an agent level to go talk to their managers to try to raise up questions. There's not a lot of empowerment that happens, but also NDAs are omnipresent in places like this. And it's not just at Facebook, it's across all platforms. It's across content moderation just in general in the commercial sphere. So it's hard for moderators to really make any progress or to even feel comfortable speaking out, especially as especially when it comes to a situation sort of like ours as contractors in an outsourcing site. It's increasing, like our distance from Facebook makes it way more difficult to raise up questions and to get answers. And you never want to be labeled as a difficult employee or the devil's advocate, because that can keep you from getting promotions. It can keep you from getting heard. It can keep you away from some of the tables where you can make meaningful change. It's, but I think the largest problem is definitely the NDAs, which can be held over your head and make it difficult for anyone to feel confident to speak up.
Right. And again, we're so appreciating both of you guys taking the time to talk to us today. Now, you worked with Viana, and in your role that you had a kind of slightly supervisory role, didn't you, on the kind of factory floor, as I think of it. And so you would have seen how hard it was for Black workers, Latinx workers to get heard. Do you remember what it was like, kind of just a general sense of morale for the people that you were working with, people in the hate speech queues or the disinformation queues?
Yeah, morale in the hate speech queue is low. I would equate it to reading comments on news articles for 6 hours a day, but with a lot more video in it. To put a person of color, like even for me, it was difficult to read how much hate there was in the world, and like to just have the constant stream of it, and even just helping them through one piece of content and seeing the next piece of content pop up after I answered their question was heartbreaking. And to know that these people are already being exposed to it in their daily lives through like just the micro racism and microaggressions just that you face as a person of color in the world. Like imagine going to work and seeing that twofold and seeing what people are like behind closed doors and then just never really having an escape from it. And as a relatively privileged white person in that situation, it was exhausting, and you run out of things to say really, really quickly because there's nothing you can say to make it better, or and you want to be able to like raise up their voices and you hope that the people will change and the policy will change, but it doesn't.
And what about your perspective on elections? You also, I think, were present for some of the debates around election security. Do you feel like things have gotten any better as far as you can tell from the other side? What was it like then? And what do you think it's going to be like this time?
I hope that things get better. The one thing that I can hope for is that they've announced changes that they're making. They're trying to make internal changes. They're trying to get ahead of the things that are happening. And they've already run through 2016 and the 2018 midterms. So I would hope that they have some more things in place to try to stop hate and violence before it spreads too far. I would also hope that they're able to get election experts that are external to the company in a lot of the rooms where the decisions are being made by moderators, and give moderators access to people that know elections inside and out, because there's also an information gap between outsourcing sites and like the people who are making the actual policy and raising the questions. So I hope that going into this election, there's going to be more real-time communication with real experts, and that the decisions are going to be made not just after something bad happens, but hopefully preemptively.
You hope that. What do you think it's going to be like for on the front line for these workers in the next couple of weeks? What do you expect?
Outrageously difficult. I think there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of policy gaps. I think that there's going to be a lot of things that go unanswered, and I think it's going to be chaos, truly.
And God forbid it should spill over into violence after all of this. But you will have been working in content moderation when there have been other events like the LA shooting, for example. What's it like? What was it like? What happened during those events?
It kind of felt like when you first see the content coming through the queues, it's on us to make the first decisions and to make the biggest decisions and to try to figure out what questions and gaps there are. And it's kind of like a game of telephone to get our questions at our site all the way up to an actual policy person who can make a decision and tell us how everyone's supposed to action across all the sites. So that's the the biggest difficulty is just the game of telephone that you kind of end up playing because of the way just corporate structures work. Agents can't make the big decisions, they can't change the policy, but they're the ones who see it first. So you have to go through all of these different levels to have a decision made, and then it has to go back down through all of the appropriate channels before you can do anything. So it makes it really difficult to do a real-time response to either whether it's violence, election security, or really anything.
And are there really kind of tough granular things around, I don't know, whether somebody's alive or dead that people may have to be kind of actioning, for example?
Oh, yeah. Well, back when I was there in 2017 and 2018, part of the policy, if we were going to mark something as disturbing, we would have to be able to verify that a person was completely incapacitated, which can be difficult depending on the angles, the cuts of videos, or how dark the video is. Like in terms of the Vegas shooting, it was super difficult to be able to identify who was incapacitated and who wasn't in a lot of the cuts of the video. So it's things like that that we end up as moderators and agents trying to make these big decisions on popular content without having full direction and guidance within 5 minutes of the event happening.
Thank you very much, Allison. Now, we've been talking about the United States, but of course, Facebook isn't only used by people in the United States, it's used all over the world. And this morning, we spoke to an anonymous Facebook moderator outside the United States who is still at the work fighting the fires, including information I think that's relevant to US elections this very week. We recorded that interview and we had it voiced over to preserve their anonymity today. And here is what they had to say. We'll just wait for Sheridan to run the video.
This is a message for Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook leadership directly from your factory floor. I'm a content moderator, one of thousands around the world. We never get to talk to you, but we are the most important, most secret part of Facebook. My office represents several countries and languages covering many millions of Facebook users. Most people who use Facebook don't know much about us, but you do. You know you depend on us to keep Facebook's community safe. You know you need us to stop lies and hate from spreading like a fire on your platform. You understand that without us, Facebook couldn't exist at all. So when you stand up in the Senate this week and talk about everything you are doing to try to keep the US elections safe, and in the next few years, elections that will affect over 1 billion people around the world, you will be talking about my work, the work of my colleagues. You will probably point to how many of us there are, over 30,000 worldwide. But there's a bunch of things you probably won't say. You won't admit you refuse to hire us directly or to give us the same basic rights as other Facebook employees. You won't say that the outsourcing firms you use pay us poorly and keep us insecure, so we just have to hold on to the job, or that many of us are migrant workers who have to keep the job or be deported. You won't admit that when we get PTSD or depression from seeing pain and violence every day, all you offer is a few debriefing sessions with a wellness coach who isn't allowed to diagnose us or to treat mental illness. And when it comes to actually dealing with the hate and lies, you won't admit that Facebook rules and policies only flow one way, from the top down. That we, the people who see what really happens on Facebook every day and might be able to stop it, are just told to keep the content up. I wish I could speak to you using my real name and my real face, but Facebook makes that impossible. Your culture of secrecy is so bad that I'm not supposed to tell my family members I work for Facebook. I certainly am not supposed to tell the truth about my work in public. The truth is, this work is incredibly important, but it's done completely wrong. And while the policy is constantly changed, the situation seems to get worse. We are all watching the election in the US and are worried. That's partly because what happens there can have an effect elsewhere. And it's partly because Facebook's rules in the US get applied elsewhere too. At the moment, it's just a mess of things. Violence, gore, hate. We could play a part in fixing these rules, but you would have to see us as what we are, the bedrock of Facebook's community, not the disposable, low-paid workforce. Hire us, train us, give us the rights of Facebook employees. You will see how much we can do to improve community. I want to thank the Real Facebook Oversight Board for giving us what Facebook never does, a chance to be heard. White supremacists and hate groups get a platform on Facebook, but Facebook's workers never really do. We believe in our work, but the work has to change. Thank you.
Hi, sorry about that. Just getting my mic up. Thanks so much for having this. I wonder for Allison and Viana. I mean, one of the things we're seeing, especially going into the election right now, is policies changing very quickly. It's almost often seeming almost on the fly that we're hearing new policies day by day. Can you talk a bit about what is that like as a moderator? What does that mean if you're already dealing with these very complex topics and then the policies themselves are changing? How does that get communicated and how does that training work?
Yeah, did you want to take that? You can go first.
Sure. It's very frustrating because when something changes from day to day, your decision from the day before was the right decision, but now today, because they told you your decision needs to be different, now today it has to be different for whatever reason they gave you. And there's just a lot less rhyme to the reason. So when it becomes very, very difficult to understand why you should be making, why this decision is the right decision. So when you're coming up against content that is different, but still very similar, you're not very sure why the last thing you change is this. So you're just like, if you're just trying to do this apples to oranges comparison, that really is not helpful towards making the right decision. And then it's bad for you because it was the wrong decision now. And so you're just basing it off of bad precedent. And so it makes it very, very difficult to move forward with making the right decision because you don't have the tools as to why that was the right decision.
And logistically, it's just really, really difficult when things change that fast because you also have to make sure that every single shift in a 24/7 cycle and people that are off those 2 days or off like weird days all have to be in have the same understanding, have the same explanation, and have the same, like every subject matter expert that was me or Viana also has to have the exact same understanding. And then all of our quality analysts also have to have the same understanding. And then all of our trainers also have to have the same understanding so that whenever there's a question or somebody's not sure where something falls on that new policy pivot, that everyone pivots in the same way. And we're talking at our site, it would be a couple hundred of us would all have to pivot at once very quickly. And that's not even including all the other sites that also have to pivot exactly the same way. So it's just really, really difficult to get information that granular and to make changes that quickly, especially when stuff changes every day. It's chaos.
And your job is on the line.
Oh yeah, that too.
Thanks. Next, I think we have Lawrence Dodds from the Daily Telegraph.
Hi all. I think hopefully you can hear and see me all right. Thanks very much for doing this, and thank you very much to all the moderators and former moderators for speaking out. I have a quick question and a sort of a proper substantial question. The quick question is, when did each of the moderators who have spoken, or the former moderators, sorry, when have Vienna and Alison actually leave that job? I might have missed that, but that would be a useful thing to know. And the other thing is just, whenever I've spoken to Facebook about this, they've always said, oh, there are no targets. We don't set targets for the sort of clear up rate of the number of content problems that are actioned per day. And I wonder if you could, is that true, or is that sort of technically true but wrong in effect? Like, how pressured actually is the job? How much time do moderators have to deal with each piece of content, and how much scope is there for them to say, actually, hey, I need more time on this one. This one's a really complicated or ambiguous one, or the stakes are high, or whatever it might be. Thank you.
Viana and Allison, should we just do the when you were there first? Yeah.
Oh yeah, we can do that. So I was there from April 2017 to April 2018.
And I was there from August of 2016 to February of 2019.
And then, you know, I don't want to be a glib summary of Lawrence's question, but it's basically, you know, they say, well, there is no target really. Is that more or less the question? Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I feel there may be a sort of technical nuance going on there where Facebook says, well, we don't set targets, but actually the contractors and the companies that actually employ a lot of the moderators might impose some kind of time pressure in some other roundabout way, right? Or they might indeed just do it straight up with targets, or it might be that people are, I remember reading about people being judged on the sort of number of things, the number of pieces of content they action each day. So there's no target, but it's like, well, when my job performance is judged on my speed, then yes, there effectively is a target, right? And so, yeah, is that true? But also just more generally, like, what is the time pressure like? What is the, because I know things seem to have changed a lot over the past like 5 years in how this job works, but maybe they haven't changed to the point where this vision of that you'd hope for of content moderators having the proper time and space to both think properly about whether something should or should not be removed, but also sort of take time for themselves and not be feeling like they're just subject to this endless cavalcade of horror.
So I can answer that kind of more at a higher level. So commercial content moderation for the most part is modeled after like call centers in the way that those work. So there's always has to be, when you have hundreds of people and you're trying to run things efficiently and you have a contractor client relationship, you're trying to make sure as a contractor that you're competing and that you're putting out relatively good numbers compared to your other competitors. So in terms of Facebook, that would be like Cognizant, Accenture, and the others that they use. So it's usually, in my experience, I think I remember it being more self-imposed, but there's always going to be that level of competition and that pressure to impress the client so that we can maintain our relationship. And I think Viana can speak more towards sort of the specifics that were expected of like moderators, because you worked a little bit more closely with like an individual team than I did. But yeah.
I would say, and I don't quote me because I actually went on leave when it got really, when the time sensitivity got really pressured, but there was definitely a point when it became really significant for you to make your decisions within 20 to 30 seconds on average. So you had the time to make a long decision, but if you took that time, you knew you had to make those next decisions pretty rapidly. So they implemented things like shorthand and short cues and stuff like that. So we had to remember the numbers for the specific decisions that we could press them faster than the search and click. So they started implementing and telling us like, hey, this is how you can cut your time down. And so you really learned how you could cut your time down on certain shorter decisions. So if you had to take time to make a longer decision, you could. So there's definitely pressure on that point. And also in terms of turnaround in time, you would think in a position like this, there would be a lot more flexibility in terms of break schedules and things like that, but that certainly wasn't the case. It was like clockwork. You had to go to break and lunch and everything at a specific time as a group together and all those things. And I'm not sure if that was very more so a mismanagement thing. But certainly wasn't helpful towards morale, I would say, because things like everybody going to lunch at the same time makes a long line at the microwave, and now you only for your 30-minute lunch, you have this much time to actually eat because you're just waiting to eat. And so little things like that are just kind of thoughtless on management. For them, it's just about, oh, I know where my people are and that's it. And it doesn't need to be micromanaged in that way. So definitely time pressure. I don't know, again, like Allison said, who implemented said pressure, but it was there, period. You had to move fast, and it was in your best interest to move quickly.
Thank you. And just to be clear, time pressure from like they want a high clear up rate, and it's not. There is also sometimes time pressure, like I assume we want to take this down quickly because it's dangerous right now, but I just want to be clear that like you're not talking about that. You're talking about they just wanted to get through a lot of decisions.
Yeah, basically they want to empty the queue out. And the queue is basically where they collect all the content for us to make decisions on. And so if there was a specific, well, again, queue that was full of content and they wanted to take care of that, they would focus a group of people on in that queue and work on that specific content. So.
And for these metrics, are you getting the perks and benefits of Facebook employees? Are you the same class of citizen as a Facebook staffer? I see your face.
No, not in the slightest. Again, so I would say around the time when they started creating different queues for people to go in. So when they made a specific like hate speech queue, it was like, okay, this is my opportunity to diversify myself in hate speech. And so as a person of color and stuff like that, it was like, well, I know hate speech, so let's go do that. But it ends up being the most terrible thing. There's no way out. And so as you made your decision to move up for your career and it was a bad decision for your personal health and stuff like that, there's no way out. They wouldn't let you go back to the regular queue if you really just wanted to. And this was too much pressure for yourself. It had to be done. Somebody had to do the hate speech and volunteer. And so
you have health insurance?
Yes, we had health insurance, but it was varied. It's just the standard health insurance, and I would say, especially in regards to the U.S. and stuff like that, mental health isn't our strong suit. So they definitely had counselors there, but it was encouraged. But again, because of the time sensitivity, you wouldn't go if it was gonna look bad on you, if it was going to mess with your time. Like you had like 15 personal minutes basically that you could play with throughout the week. And 15 minutes, mind you, you're supposed to go use the restroom during your 15-minute breaks and all that stuff as well. So it really just makes it very difficult to have any bit of autonomy. You got to ask to go to the bathroom like you're a child. If you really got to go. And again, with people who have like varied health issues and stuff like that, if you're like literally sick and you're throwing up, you're worried about whether or not you're back at the queue while you're throwing up. It's just not great for moving forward in your career space. But you do love the job and you enjoy your coworkers as well because they're all very thoughtful people. Everybody who's done content moderation is a thoughtful person.
Thank you. Ashley Gold from Axios is next.
Thank you.
Hi all, thanks for sharing your stories. I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the specific policy debate around this, if this is something you've given thought. A lot of people talk about Section 230 and how taking it away would make things better, but as you guys know, Section 230 is what allows you guys to do your jobs in the first place. And we all know that at the hearing on Wednesday, we'll be hearing a lot about Section 230 and conservative bias when the issues at hand really are the jobs you're doing and content moderation and how hard it is at scale. What do you think of that general debate? Do you think Section 230 needs to change in any way? And how do you think these kind of public policy discussions kind of cloud what you guys are trying to express about your experiences?
So I personally don't think that Section 230 really needs to change. It's more of responsibility needs to be pushed back onto publishers to be able to to do their social responsibility and to acknowledge what's going on. In terms of the Senate debates, I personally find them really frustrating to listen to because they seem to get clouded by conservative bias when the issues at hand are actually more labor issues, worker rights, and actually making moderation into something that could be a sustainable career. So I think that's where a lot of stuff gets lost in the conversation, is because they're so worried about getting that conversation and bias in there. And that's a lot of these issues could be fixed by just improving the way content moderation works at scale, just by bringing moderators in full time, by listening to the people on the front lines and their policy suggestions. And I truly think that if there's just more of a collaboration at the base level and with the agents doing the work, that a lot of these issues and this perceived bias and a lot of these conversations could actually start to shift and change. But I don't think Section 230 actually needs to be different or adjusted or added onto. I think that kind of takes away from the autonomy of just freedom of speech anyway. And I think it would cause more issues to try to figure out what line you would have to draw than it would to just leave it as is and try to figure things out from a different avenue.
Next is Will from 10. Oh, Sarah had something. Sarah, I think you had your hand up there, actually.
Yeah, I was just gonna.
Yeah, and then we'll go to Will. Sorry, Will. Hang on. Yep.
Yeah, sorry.
No, please.
I was just gonna add that you know, that a lot of the difficulty that the firms now find themselves in with regard to being brought forward in Congress is because of their unwillingness to be transparent about their practices. And so what has happened over time is that conservative, liberal, right, left, wherever you are on the spectrum, you feel personally aggrieved by not understanding the decisions that are made by Facebook and others. You know, if your stuff comes down, you feel like you've been targeted for your politics. And one of the big gaps that people like Viana and Allison are being, in my opinion, unfairly asked to fill is the lack of willingness on the part of Facebook, on the C-suite executives, to clearly delineate what Facebook's politics actually are. So perhaps some of the difficulty that the moderators are running into, and that particularly Viana described, is that maybe Facebook isn't trying to be completely inhospitable to white supremacists, because they're trying to be all things to everyone at all time. And so what you have is a high level set of politics that are sort of anodyne and banal, and then you have granularity to the point of absurdity, where Allison is trying to figure out if someone is incapacitated or not, and the whole middle section, which we would call politics, is absent. So this is what's putting the firms on the line, and this is what's putting Section 230 on the line. I would say that the firms have really enjoyed all of the reward and very little of the responsibility, and that's the equation that somehow needs to change, whether through 230 or some other means.
Thanks, Sarah. Now, Will, to you from 10. I think you're next in the queue for the question.
Thanks, and thanks to both Allison and Viana for speaking out and for being here. Both of you mentioned in slightly different ways, I think, that as content moderators, you would sometimes have ideas for improving the policies or practices, or you wanted to flag something that was wrong, and Facebook didn't make that easy. I was wondering if either of you could share an example, if there's any example that comes to mind of a time that you or a colleague noticed a way that something could be better, or had a suggestion to improve the policy, and what avenues were available to you to communicate that up the chain, or to convey that to Facebook, and sort of what happened, if anything.
Specific policy. I don't really remember what happened specifically, but I will speak about when white supremacy really started getting handled on the platform, and people again started being vocal about it and stuff like that. Facebook put out some policy directives that specifically spoke to white supremacy, white nationalism, and there was one more line, I forget what it is. But ultimately, what it really just came down to is that, like, I was arguing about white pride and the fact that when people say white pride, it's racist. And they're like, well, you can say black pride. I'm like, right, because then that's not racist. And I just found myself arguing with them on the difference. And I'm like, the difference is that when people say white pride, they're being racist. And the examples are, when you can say Irish pride, you can say Greek, you can be proud about who you are, but when people are using the term white pride, so to speak, they're being specific about what they're trying to say, and the fact that they're really more for white supremacy. But Facebook made it very clear about where the line, where they were trying to draw the line. White nationalism was very okay for them. So somebody could say, I am able to, because I want my kids to live in a white world and a white life, that's okay for me. And that's okay to leave up on the platform, and they would be not necessarily in support of that, but basically they're creating a space where somebody can be very open about wanting to segregate and be I don't know what the word I want to use. So basically, they made it okay to really just kind of segregate and ensure that it was safe for everybody on the platform. But I felt it was safe for white supremacists on the platform and not necessarily safe for my Black life, so to speak. And that's really what I felt like the message ended up being.
Thanks, Fiona. Next is Sarah from Bloomberg. And I think that's actually the last question we're going to take, and then we'll kind of close.
Hi. So my question is about what the shift to AI for content moderation has done for the basically the queue of what kind of content you guys get to see, and whether you think that user reports are being looked at with the same priority as reports that are coming from just the automated systems, and if it's made the job at all easier or harder. Thank you.
During my time there, we didn't have it was hard, and like we didn't have a lot of visibility into what was a user report and what was an AI report. I think like sometimes you could see the name of the person who reported it, but not even all the time or consistently. I don't know how much that's changed, but my guess and assumption would be that as AI gets better at recognizing patterns and like regular and stuff that's constantly posted that we were used to seeing, we'll just end up getting more of the extreme borderline content and having to make harder decisions more often. I don't know if Fiona has more experience with that, if that changed.
No, I would say it's ultimately the same thing. Like, just it really, at the time, it just really wasn't the best indicator for what was violating or not. And so as it felt like job security for sure. Like, this bot is not going to be able to catch up with us because the internet keeps changing. And as soon as you recognize a pattern, the internet will change the pattern. And I think that's really the human nature of it. So I think you're right in regards to it'll work on and get better at the minute content, but there's always going to be borderline because we're good at that as people, and that's what we do. So the algorithm and the bots are only going to be able to do so much. There's still going to be a need for a content moderator always.
Just to jump in and add, the active content moderator I spoke to this morning, whose recording you heard, of course, has been continuing to work through this system while it's been going on. And there was some idea, I think, during that brief period when they were working from home, that they would be supposed to be seeing less of the kind of gory and graphic content. But it seems to me that the system isn't working. That has got to be the core reason that everybody's being hauled back in during the pandemic, even with live COVID cases, in places like Austin. I don't know, Sarah, if that fits with your experience or what you've been told.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what the COVID crisis has revealed is, as Viana has indicated, which is that there cannot be effective content moderation at scale for these platforms without humans directly engaged and directly vetting decisions that AI perhaps has made. So it's not sufficient to just sort of let the computational tools run unattended or without oversight from humans. And so in effect, what's happened in many cases is that by virtue of engaging AI and machine learning based tools, what happens is the kind of proactive seeking of content yields more content for humans to review. And in essence, this sort of big hope that AI would somehow come in and supersede the need for humans to engage with the content, which is a problematic notion for its own reasons. The material fact is that it's done the opposite. It's like producing more content for people like Vienna and Allison to contend with rather than less in many cases. And as they indicated, those cases that they also are left to really ponder might be much more difficult than they might see in a queue that was untouched by material already dealt with by AI.
Great. So that's the hour that we've got. I just want to close, I think, going back to Viana and Allison. It's been such a privilege to hear from you. As I say, we never hear from this workforce. And in a couple of days, Mark Zuckerberg is going to be there in the Senate once again, trying to defend Facebook's positions on this stuff. If there's one thing you'd tell Mark Zuckerberg now, what would it be?
All right, I'll go. Find ways to bring moderators on full time. It's not going to happen before the election, but I think that the content moderator workforce is absolutely passionate about what they do and is full of great ideas. And being on the front lines, they have an incredible amount of exposure to content and really great ideas for how to make the platform better, safer, and to just moderate it at scale.
And I would say just really for the demands, really, I like she said, he has to employ the content moderators directly. There can't be a separation and this adversarial relationship that was developed between content moderators that actually work for Facebook and outsourced content moderators. And also really the algorithm isn't helpful towards really the goals. I think it needs to be looked at really what the algorithm's goal is. It definitely seems to perpetuate more hate than anything. And so if the work can be done towards that, and that would be very, very helpful. And like we've been saying, listening to content moderators, I think that's the long and short of it. When you talk about what's happening at the Senate, I think there's just more of them not listening to content moderators. So while I really want for that to be what's taken away from this. The content moderators know the difference. They're going to understand the nuances. It's very complex. It's not a simple answer to any of this, but the content moderators knows where that nuance is because they do it every day, because they're in it every day. They know where the gap is, and you don't really know until you're doing it, and you can't understand until you've done it. And I just don't really know how else to explain that human experience that is understanding how the internet is changing on a constant basis. So they have to listen to content moderators. And then the performance goals, where the performance goals are at, again, I don't know what they're telling everybody what the actual goals are, but it's adversarial. I don't get to talk to my coworker and come up with the right answer because this is the right answer for the platform. I have to be right because it's gonna be my job or not to be right. And if they disagree with me, the same thing is on the line. So we're arguing just to keep our jobs and not to do what's right for the platform. And then that also just comes down to the support. This is a taxing job, and people are beyond exhausted. We enjoy the work. The work makes us critically think the way I like to critically think, but it definitely has to have more support to be able to do the work and withstand the onslaught that is content, because people think of just new and amazing ways to troll and to hurt other people. And as a content moderator, it's your job to really, really at least be the buffer between that. Because like I remember when Stephen Hawking died, there was no time between they started making memes about his death. And they were just like, immediately, he wasn't cold at all. And it started coming in on the queue. And that's just how quickly the internet responds. And I think we're getting more and more jaded by the violence, by the hate and stuff. So it's getting more and more easier to even just make jokes about it. And so I think as a content moderator, they need the support because it's a hard place to be.
Viana, Allison, Sarah, and Jade, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the Real Facebook Oversight Board and, of course, people in the press. These workers really are the bedrock on which social media's empire stands, and it is high time we all lift up their voices more and hear more from them. So thank you very much for attending this session.